In the fading light of a crisp autumn evening in 1987, the small town of Eldridge Hollow nestled quietly under a canopy of turning leaves, the kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked, and the biggest scandal was who won the church bake sale. Sheriff Harlan Tate wiped the sweat from his brow as he steered his old Ford pickup down the winding dirt road toward the old Grayson farmstead, the radio crackling with static that seemed to echo the unease gnawing at his gut. It had been over a year since those kids, little Tommy, Sarah, and their big brother Jake, had gone missing on that ill-fated hike with their folks, swallowed up by the woods like so many whispers in the wind. The search parties had combed every inch of those pines, dogs barking into the empty night, helicopters chopping the air above, but nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint. The parents had crumbled under the weight of it, the mother taking to her bed with grief, the father drowning his sorrow at the local tavern until he wrapped his car around a tree one stormy night. Folks said the Graysons were cursed, but Harlan didn't believe in curses. Not then. The call had come in just after dawn, from Old Man Wilkins out by the mill. "Sheriff," he'd rasped over the line, his voice trembling like a leaf in a gale, "you ain't gonna believe this, but them Grayson kids, they're here. Wandered out of the trees like ghosts. Ain't said a word, but their eyes. God, their eyes." Harlan's heart had skipped, a cold finger tracing down his spine as he grabbed his hat and gun, the weight of the badge suddenly heavier than ever. By the time he pulled up to the weathered farmhouse, a small crowd had gathered, neighbors with wide eyes and hushed voices, the autumn chill doing nothing to dispel the prickling heat of anticipation. The children sat on the porch steps, huddled together under a threadbare blanket, their faces pale as milk, hair matted with leaves and dirt. They looked unchanged. Not a day older, not a scratch on them. But something was off, something that made the hairs on Harlan's arms stand straight up. He knelt down slow, like approaching a skittish deer, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "Hey there, kids. It's me, Sheriff Tate. You remember me? From the summer fairs." Tommy, the youngest, lifted his head first, those big blue eyes locking onto Harlan's with an intensity that belied his 8 years. No fear, no relief, just a knowing, like he'd seen things no child should. Sarah clutched her brother's hand, her lips parted as if to speak, but only a faint whisper escaped, carried away by the breeze. Jake, the eldest, stared past them all, into the woods that loomed like silent sentinels at the edge of the property. Harlan felt it then, that creeping dread, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting. They brought the kids inside, into the dim kitchen where the clock ticked too loud against the silence. A doctor was called, officials notified, but as the questions began, gentle at first, probing, the children's words started to spill out like water from a cracked dam. Not tales of kidnappers or getting lost, no. What they described was something else entirely, something that twisted the ordinary into the nightmarish, making the room grow colder with every syllable. Harlan leaned in, notebook forgotten, as the story unfolded, each detail chipping away at the world he thought he knew. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor, he realized nothing would ever be the same. The Grayson children had returned, but what they'd brought back with them, that was the real horror. June 28, 1986, broke hot and still over Eldridge Hollow, the kind of Maine summer morning that smells of pine sap and river water, when the air itself feels thick enough to chew. Richard and Ellen Grayson had packed their old Dodge van the night before, cooler of lemonade, peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a battered Coleman tent that still carried the faint mildew scent of last year's trip, and by 7:30 they were rolling north on Route 11 with the windows down and the radio playing low. In the back seat, 12-year-old Jacob pressed his face to the glass, tracing the blur of green with one finger, already planning the fort he would build out of fallen birch. 10-year-old Sarah clutched her Polaroid camera like a talisman, promising herself she would finally catch a picture of the moose everyone said lived near Little Wapscut Lake. 8-year-old Tommy bounced between them, legs too short to reach the floor, singing made-up songs about bears and treasure maps. They reached the trailhead at the edge of the Blackwood Reserve just past 9. The parking lot was empty except for a single rusted pickup that belonged to a ranger who'd waved them on with a lazy salute. Richard hoisted the heaviest pack, Ellen carried the water bottles and the first aid kit, and the children darted ahead along the pine needle path, their sneakers kicking up the sweet dust of summer. The trail was well marked, blazes of faded yellow paint on the trunks, and the Graysons were experienced enough campers to know the rules: stay together, make noise, never leave the path after dusk. They planned a simple overnight loop: 6 miles in, camp by the lake, 6 miles out the next morning. Nothing ambitious, nothing risky. By noon they had reached the water's edge, sunlight shattering across the surface like scattered coins. The children shrieked and splashed while Ellen laid out lunch on a flat rock and Richard strung a torp between 2 hemlocks in case of rain. Photographs from that afternoon show them sunburned and laughing: Sarah holding up a frog, Tommy with chocolate smeared across his chin, Jacob standing on a stump like a conqueror. The last picture, taken at 4:17 p.m., captures all 5 of them waving at the camera, the forest behind them dense and dark and utterly ordinary. At 4:42 p.m. the camera was found on the trail, lens cracked, a single frame half exposed, only treetops and sky. By nightfall the Graysons had not returned to the parking lot. By midnight the ranger had called it in. By dawn the search began, and the Blackwood, vast and silent, swallowed every trace of the family as cleanly as if they had never existed at all. The first week was chaos. State troopers, National Guard helicopters, bloodhounds brought up from Augusta, volunteers in orange vests beating through the underbrush until their hands bled from blackberry thorns. The dogs tracked the families sent 2 miles past the lake, then circled a clearing the size of a living room, noses to the ground, whining in confusion before sitting down and refusing to move. The helicopters flew grid patterns so low the rotor wash flattened the ferns, but the pilots saw nothing except mile after mile of unbroken green. Reporters camped at the trailhead, feeding nightly updates to the networks, still no sign of the Grayson family. Ellen's sister flew in from Bangor and stood sobbing in front of the cameras, clutching a stuffed giraffe that had belonged to Tommy. By the second week the crowds thinned. Rain came, heavy and relentless, turning the trails to mud and washing away whatever faint traces might have remained. The search radius widened, then widened again, until it encompassed hundreds of square miles of some of the densest wilderness east of the Mississippi. A psychic from Portland arrived with a pendulum and left 2 days later, pale and shaking, refusing to say what she had felt. Children in Eldridge Hollow began waking from nightmares about the quiet woods that eat people. The church held candlelight vigils, the hardware store sold out of compass keychains and whistle lanyards. Someone started a rumor that Richard Grayson had been in debt to dangerous men and staged the whole thing for insurance money. Someone else claimed to have seen strange lights above the treetops the night they vanished. Autumn arrived early that year, the leaves bleeding red and gold while the official bulletins grew shorter. The command tent came down. The dogs went home. The case file migrated from the conference room to a cardboard box in the evidence locker, then to a shelf in the basement of the county courthouse. By Thanksgiving the Graysons had become the town's ghost story, the cautionary tale parents whispered when teenagers talked about sneaking off to party in the Blackwood. On quiet nights you could still hear the wind moving through the pines like a long, slow exhale, and people swore it carried 3 small voices calling for their mother, though no one could ever agree on exactly where the sound came from. February 14, 1987, dawned iron-gray and bitter, the kind of cold that finds the gap between collar and neck and stays there. Clyde Wilkins and his son Ray were running a skidder line 3 miles inside the old timber lease, the chainsaw's scream echoing off the frozen ridges. They had been at it since first light, felling hemlock for a mill order, when the engine coughed and died. Ray stepped down to check the fuel line and noticed the silence that followed: no birds, no wind, just the low metallic tick of cooling steel. That was when Clyde saw them. 3 small figures emerged from the fog that pooled between the trunks like milk in a bowl. They walked single file, barefoot on the crusted snow, moving with the deliberate calm of sleepwalkers. The oldest, Jacob, led, his dark hair grown past his shoulders and tangled with twigs. Sarah came next, clutching something against her chest that might once have been her Polaroid camera. Tommy trailed behind, one hand on his sister's coat as though afraid the forest might change its mind and pull them back. Their clothes hung in rags, the same clothes from the missing posters: Jake's red flannel, Sarah's yellow rain jacket now the color of old mustard, Tommy's tiny denim overalls split at the knees. Yet their skin was unmarked, no frostbite, no scratches, no sign they had spent a single night outdoors, let alone 231. Clyde's first thought was that he was seeing ghosts, His second was that the boys at the mill would never let him live it down if he ran. He called out, voice cracking like thin ice. The children stopped 10 yards away and turned in perfect unison. Their eyes were too large, too bright, reflecting the weak winter sun the way a cat's do in headlights. Ray would later swear the temperature rose 10 degrees the moment they appeared, that the snow around their bare feet melted in perfect circles while the rest of the ground stayed hard. They did not speak. They did not run to the men or cry or ask for their mother. They simply waited, patient as stones, while Clyde fumbled for the radio on his belt and told the dispatcher, in a voice he barely recognized, that the Grayson kids were standing in front of him and that somebody needed to get out here right goddamn now. The children were wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of mothballs and placed in the back of Deputy Mallett's cruiser, heater cranked so high the windows fogged. They sat in a row like nesting dolls, knees touching, hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead as though the windshield were a screen playing a film only they could see. At the sheriff's annex they were led past the bullpen where clerks and deputies fell silent mid-sentence, coffee cups frozen halfway to mouths. Someone had found 3 paper cups of hot chocolate from the diner, the marshmallows dissolved untouched. Dr. Halvorsen arrived with his black bag and gentle voice, checking pupils, pulse, temperature. Everything normal. Too normal. No dehydration, no vitamin deficiencies, no parasites, no evidence at all that they had been anywhere except perhaps tucked safely in bed for the last 8 months. When he asked them to open their mouths, each child obediently parted pale lips and revealed teeth still carrying the faint white spots of summer fluoride treatments from the previous June. For the first 48 hours they refused speech entirely. They would tilt their heads at questions the way a dog does when it hears an unfamiliar noise, curious but uncomprehending, or perhaps comprehending too much. They ate when coaxed, plain oatmeal, saltines, slices of apple arranged in perfect moons, but never asked for more and never spoke thanks. At night they insisted on sleeping in the same room, curled together on 2 pushed-together cots beneath a blanket printed with faded rockets, breathing in unison like a single organism. It was Marjorie Leake, the county social worker with her soft cardigans and inexhaustible patience, who finally broke the wall. On the 3rd afternoon she sat cross-legged on the carpet with Tommy, pushing a wooden train around an oval track, making no demands. After 20 silent laps the little boy placed his hand over hers to stop the train and whispered, so low she felt it more than heard it, "They told us not to tell." His voice carried no fear, only the exhausted certainty of a child who has carried an unbearable secret across an impossible distance. Marjorie's heart stuttered, but she kept her face neutral and asked, as gently as drawing a splinter, "Who told you, sweetheart?" Tommy looked toward the window where late winter light slanted through dusty blinds, and for the first time since they had stepped out of the trees, one of the Grayson children began to cry without sound, tears sliding down cheeks that had forgotten how to flush. The first real words came from Jacob, late on the 4th night, after the building had emptied to just Marjorie, Sheriff Tate, and a child psychologist flown in from Boston who kept clearing his throat too loudly. They had moved the children to a converted conference room with beanbags and a one-way mirror no one pretended wasn't there. Jacob sat on the edge of a table, legs dangling, picking at a scab that wasn't there the day before. When he finally spoke his voice was flat, almost bored, the way children sound when reciting something memorized against their will. "We didn't get lost," he said. "They took us." The psychologist leaned forward too quickly. Jacob's eyes flicked to him and the man sat back as though pushed. Marjorie kept her hands still in her lap and waited. "They came out of the ground," Jacob continued. "Not people. Taller. Skin like wet bark. No faces, just places where faces should have been. They smelled like after a lightning strike." He rubbed his nose as if the smell still clung there. "They put their hands over our mouths so we couldn't scream and pulled us down through a hole that opened under the pine needles. It wasn't a cave. Caves don't have doors." Sarah, curled in an armchair with her knees to her chest, made a small sound, agreement or protest, impossible to tell. Tommy had fallen asleep against her side, thumb in mouth, something he hadn't done since he was 4. Jacob described stairs that spiraled the wrong way, carved from roots thicker than his waist. Air that got warmer the deeper they went. Light that came from nowhere and everywhere, the color of old bruises. Halls wide enough for 20 people abreast, lined with shelves of stone jars that hummed when you walked past. He spoke in short, precise sentences, the way a soldier reports to a superior who already knows most of it and is only waiting for confirmation. "They walked us for a long time," he said. "Days, maybe. We stopped being hungry. We stopped needing to pee." Sarah tried to run once and the floor just moved her back. Like it was alive. He looked at Marjorie then, for the first time since he had started talking, and something ancient moved behind his 12-year-old eyes. "They weren't mean," he whispered. "That was the worst part. They were careful. Like we were something valuable they didn't want to break." The adults laughed at first. Not cruelly, just the tired, reflexive chuckle of people who have seen too many grieving parents invent aliens or Bigfoot to explain why their child never came home. Sheriff Tate poured himself another cup of the sheriff station coffee that tasted like burnt pennies and told the state police captain, "Kids have imaginations the size of Texas when they're scared." The psychologist scribbled shared delusion secondary to trauma in his notebook and underlined it twice. They scheduled the children for EEGs, play therapy, a full psychiatric battery at Maine Medical. Case closed, almost. A miracle wrapped in a little harmless fantasy. Then the inconsistencies began to surface like bodies in spring thaw. Sarah, during art therapy, drew the front page of the Portland Press-Herald dated September 12, 1986, 3 months after they vanished, complete with the headline about the mill closing and the photograph of the governor shaking hands with the union rep. She rendered the grainy halftone dots with a blue crayon, perfect rose, impossible for a 10-year-old to fake from memory she shouldn't have. When asked where she'd seen it, she shrugged and said, "It was on the table when they let us look up for a minute." Tommy, half asleep on a cot, murmured the exact score of the Red Sox game that had played the night before the loggers found them, 7-4 in the 11th, Oilk and Boyd pitching, a walk-off homer by Jim Rice. No radio had been in the room. The deputy watching the monitors swore the boy hadn't stirred for hours. Jacob corrected the psychologist on the date his own mother had died. Not Ellen Grayson, but the psychologist's mother, whose obituary had run in the Bangor Daily News only 6 weeks earlier. He recited the first 2 lines of the death notice word for word, then looked embarrassed, as if he'd read something private over an adult's shoulder. The laughter dried up fast. Files were pulled back out of boxes. Tape recordings of the initial interviews were played and replayed until the reels squeaked. Every adult who had been in the room when the children first spoke was asked, quietly and separately, whether anyone could have coached them, fed them details. No one could. The state police captain stopped joking about Texas-sized imaginations and started drinking the same burnt coffee without complaint. In the margins of reports, question marks multiplied like mold. The miracle was still a miracle, but the harmless fantasy had begun to smell like something that had been buried too long. Jacob drew the maps on the backs of missing person flyers, the kind with their own faces staring up from the corners. He used a stub of pencil he had carried since the woods, chewing the end when he concentrated. The lines were thin and certain, no hesitation, no eraser marks. Straight corridors, perfect right angles, concentric circles that looked almost printed. When Marjorie asked what the symbols along the edges meant, Jacob only said, "Doors that aren't doors," and kept drawing. Sheriff Tate took the first map out himself, half convinced it was nonsense, half afraid it wasn't. He followed a compass bearing from the loggers' skidder track, past the place where the children had appeared, deeper than any sane person went in February. 3 hours in he found the clearing Jacob had sketched, a slight depression ringed by hemlocks so old their trunks were fluted like cathedral pillars. The ground was bare of snow, warmed from beneath. In the center lay a single slab of stone the size of a pickup truck, black and glassy, veined with something that caught the weak sun and threw it back green. A week later they came back with a full team, state geologist, 2 archaeologists from the university, a nervous lieutenant who kept checking his sidearm. Ground-penetrating radar painted impossible shapes 30 feet down, corridors, chambers, a spiral that descended in a perfect golden ratio. They brought in a drill rig borrowed from a quarry in Augusta. The bit screamed for 6 hours, then dropped 3 inches and spun free, as if the rock had simply opened its mouth and let go. When they lowered a camera on a cable, the screen filled with angles that hurt to look at, walls of the same black glass, etched with grooves that moved when you weren't staring directly at them. At the bottom of the shaft, the lens caught a row of niches, each holding a stone jar the height of a child. One jar was empty, its lid lying beside it like a discarded coin. The geologist's voice came over the radio, thin and shaking. Whatever this is, it wasn't built by any culture we know. Not native, not colonial, not anything. The stone's older than the bedrock it's sitting in. Back at the station, Jacob looked at the photographs spread across the table and nodded once, the way a carpenter nods when a joint fits true. Sarah traced a finger over the empty niche and whispered, "That one was ours." The deeper interviews took place in a windowless room with a tape recorder the size of a lunchbox and a red light that blinked like a dying star. The children no longer needed coaxing. They spoke in shifts, as though the words themselves were a burden too heavy for one small body to carry alone. Sarah began with the council. 7 figures seated on root thrones in a chamber shaped like the inside of a nautilus shell. They never moved, never blinked, but the children felt their attention settle on them the way snow settles, slow, inevitable, cold. When the council wished to speak, the air itself formed words inside your head, bypassing ears entirely. "They showed us pictures," Sarah said, hugging her knees. "Not with eyes. With memory." The town burning in 1723. The preacher nailing the barn door shut with 31 people still inside. The river running red for 3 days after. They kept every scream. Tommy took over without looking up from the carpet. His voice was a sleepy murmur, as if he were recounting a bedtime story he'd heard too many times. He named names everyone in Eldridge Hollow pretended had died of fever or accident. Mercy Whitcomb drowned in 6 inches of water, Reverend Hale found hanging from his own bell rope, old Amos Pike who vanished the same night his wife's tongue was cut out. Dates, times, the exact weight of the stones used to hold Mercy under. Details no living archive still held. Jacob saved the worst for last. He recited the compact, how the first settlers traded something unnamed for the right to stay, how every generation paid a tithe of 3 children, always in summer, always gone without trace. The council had grown impatient. The town had begun cheating, moving away, locking doors, pretending the woods were just woods. So the debt was called in all at once. The Graysons had simply been the first installment. When Jacob finished, the tape kept running for another 47 seconds of perfect silence. Then the red light blinked out by itself, though the recorder still had 20 minutes of tape left and the batteries were new. In the hallway outside, Marjorie found the photographs of the current town selectmen rearranged on the bulletin board, each man's face circled in red crayon and the year 1723 written beneath in a child's careful block letters. The first to break was Deputy Mallet, who had been on duty the night Jacob described the council. He woke at 3:14 a.m. screaming that bark-skinned hands were growing out of his bedroom ceiling, fingers threading down toward his face like blind roots. His wife found him crouched in the closet, fingernails torn and bloody from clawing at the plaster. When the ambulance came he kept repeating, "They're still measuring me," though no one understood what it meant. Sheriff Tate started seeing the children's footprints in places they could not possibly have been, pressed into the dust on top of filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in years, appearing overnight in the sugar spilled on his kitchen counter. He poured whiskey into his coffee and told himself it was exhaustion until the morning he found the footprints walking straight up the wall and across the ceiling above his bed. Marjorie Leake's nightmares were quieter. She dreamed of standing in the Nautilus chamber while the council weighed her childhood sins on a scale made of children's teeth. Each night the scale tipped a little farther. She began sleeping with the lights on and a circle of salt around the bed that her cat refused to cross. The state police captain who had laughed the loudest discovered every mirror in his house cracked in a perfect spiral the day after he signed the order to close the investigation again. When he tried to throw the mirrors out, the shards rearranged themselves in the trash bag into the same pattern as the underground corridors. He took emergency leave and drove south until the radio lost the main stations, but the cracks followed him in the windshield of his car. At the station, objects developed opinions. Case files slid off desks when no one was looking and landed open to the original 1723 land grants. The evidence locker door swung wide at night and the stone jar photographs were always on top in the morning, no matter how deep they had been buried. One deputy quit after finding his service revolver disassembled on his desk, every screw arranged to form the same 7-point symbol the children drew when asked what the council looked like. No one spoke of it openly anymore. They communicated in glances and half-finished sentences, the way people do when the air itself has begun to listen. The youngest spoke last, as if the words had been saved for the moment when everything else had already cracked. It was Tommy, curled in Marjorie's lap during what was meant to be a routine play session, his small fingers tracing invisible patterns on her sleeve. The room was dim, late afternoon light slanting through half-closed blinds, casting bars across the carpet like prison windows. The tape recorder sat forgotten on the side table, its red light a dull ember. Tommy had been silent for days, content to watch his siblings unravel the horror in measured doses, but now his breath quickened, a tiny storm building inside. "They told us everything," he whispered, eyes fixed on some point beyond the wall. "Not just the old deaths. The now. The after." Marjorie held him closer, feeling the unnatural warmth of his skin, as if the underground heat still lingered in his bones. He described the council's final gift, a vision projected directly into their minds, sharp as a fever dream. The town of Eldridge Hollow, swallowed by the forest in a single night. Trees bursting through foundations, roots coiling around the steeple like fingers claiming a toy. People screaming as the ground opened, pulling them down into the same twisting halls the children had walked. But not all at once. A chain reaction, starting small, sinkholes in the cemetery where the old graves lay, then cracks spidering through Main Street, the mill groaning as its timbers splintered from within. "The year it happens," Tommy continued, voice steady now, almost adult in its certainty, "is when the last debt pair dies. Mr. Wilkins. The one who found us. He's the great-great-grandson of the first settler who made the deal. When he goes, the council collects everything. Wilkins, hale at 72, chopping wood daily, no ailments but the usual aches." Yet Tommy recited the date of his death as if reading from a calendar, April 17, 2023, heart failure in his sleep, alone in the cabin where the children had first been spotted. And after. The cataclysm. The forest reclaiming not just the town but the whole county, roots tunneling miles underground, bursting through highways, wrapping around the interstate like vines claiming a forgotten trellis. A green apocalypse, silent and inevitable, the council's long patience finally spent. Marjorie felt the room tilt. She glanced at the one-way mirror, knowing Tate and the others watched, faces pale in the observation booth. Tommy looked up then, his eyes clear and pitiless. "We're the warning," he said. "They let us go to tell you. Stop it, or join it." The words hung there, heavy as wet earth, promising salvation or doom in the same breath, a prophecy etched in the fragile bones of children who had seen too much and returned forever changed.